I do appreciate that these rooms have the old pencil sharpeners. It really takes me back. And apparently they're sometimes useful. Is there anybody else that's here for the first time today? Oh, awesome. All right. We're at noon, so let's go ahead and get started for today. Happy Friday, and glad to have you all back. So we've got a couple new faces today. A lot of folks who have continued to be here, so thank you for continuing to come to class. So one thing that I like to do, and I'll be doing at the start of pretty much every class from here on out, is giving you a practice question that you don't need to turn in, that's not graded, but is an example of a kind of question that you would receive on the midterm. So again, the midterm is open note, it's half multiple choice, half short essay, and I'll give you a practice question that goes over some of the things that we talked about in the last class. So I encourage you to use the first few minutes, maybe look back through your notes from the previous class meeting. And this is a great way to check in about how closely you followed things last class and see if you're on track. If you're feeling good about these questions, great, you're doing really well. If not, you might just want to review some of the things from that last class meeting. So I'll give you a couple minutes to look back through your notes and to think about this question, and then we'll talk about it together. So Kevin asks Amanda to teach him how to paint. Rather than doing it as a job, Kevin's interested in painting in order to better express himself creatively. Sounds a lot of fun. According to Maslow's hierarchy of needs, what is the type of need that Kevin is fulfilling in his communication? So either safety, physiological, self-actualization, or love and belonging. I'll give you a couple minutes to think about it, and then we'll talk about this question together. Is there anybody who would like some more time on this question? Great. Let's chat about it. So what Kevin is communicating to Amanda is one of these things. How many people think it's A, safety, B, physiological, C, self-actualization, or D, love and belonging? All right. The majority have it. The correct answer is self-actualization. Right? If you recall last class, Maslow's hierarchy of needs was a pyramid. And the way that this pyramid works is that as human beings, right, we communicate in order to fulfill some of these needs at the very bottom before we can work our way up to self-actualization, right? If we are starving and can't afford food and water, we're probably not interested in becoming an artist and expressing ourselves creatively. Unless we're starving artists, which are some of the best creative minds, but they're doing that, right, in order to fulfill some of those physiological or safety needs. So one way of thinking about this is thinking about our communication as oriented around goals. In other words, if Kevin is choosing to communicate through art to express himself, he's doing it for self-actualization, about creativity. But if he was doing it because he is out of a job, really wants people to buy his art and is trying to make a living, then he would be communicating for safety needs and so on, right? So goals and motivations are really important for us to think about when we're assessing communication with this hierarchy in mind. Again, I'm glad most of you got this right. Think about this as an example of the type of question you should see, a scenario or situation where you're asked to apply and use these things, right? Love and belonging wouldn't be the best answer here because there's nothing in that sentence to indicate that Kevin was doing it for his relationship with Amanda in particular. Although he could be secretly, I'm not sure. So we went over Maslow's hierarchy last class, talking about the needs that we fulfill through communication. We also spent some time going over some resources available on campus to help with your success. So if you're new today, we reviewed some of the things, including the Writing Center and tutoring that are available. So if you check out slides from last class, you can check out those links. And those are really great resources to help you with your success in this class. We'll be dedicating a bit more time on Monday to talk about writing and talk about how to do citations. We also talked about this idea of semiotics, the ways that we use symbols to communicate, right? This idea that communication is the use of symbols to convey shared meaning. We say, I want to go to the Apple store, and we know in our heads that the Apple store refers to the company. We use context in order to understand symbols through shared meaning. And then lastly, we talked about different genres of communication. Had you all work in groups to talk about, for instance, intrapersonal versus group versus public. As folks pointed out, right, there's blurriness between some of those lines, especially between mediated and public. But we're really looking at communication between two people. Any questions about anything we went over last class or anything about the course in general at this point? Yes.
For the assignment that the student did, do you want it cited? Or do you want to?
Sure.
Sure.
Oh, sorry. Sure, I understand your question. So you do not need to formally cite sources for your Canvas prompts, right? Those can be a bit more informal. The essay that you'll be doing later, I'll want the formal citations for. So we'll be going over kind of some tips on writing in general and tips on how to write for some of those formal assignments for your classes. Yeah.
Do you want us to be using those?
You can if it's useful, right? The general tip that I'll give you about quotes, and we'll talk a bit more about this on Monday, is make sure that you are using the sort of full span of that quotation. So if you have a really big block quote and then you're just kind of leaving it there, it's not really that useful. Like explain what it is about that quote you're gaining. So for instance, Wrench states that interpersonal communication includes noise or distortion. What this means is, right? So include quotes if they're useful to you. But yes, good questions. The first Canvas prompt is due by the end of the day today. You can choose to take it or, right, if you don't, you can complete 6 others in the class. There's 8 total that you can choose from. One other note is that I also posted your attendance for last class. I post it based on the names of things that are turned in. But I also know that sometimes the names that are listed on Canvas are different than the name you might go by. So if there's ever something inaccurate on the attendance record, like you're marked as absent on a day you should be present for, please let me know and I'm happy to fix that for you. All right. So we've got a couple new faces today. One thing that I've been asking everybody that's new to the class to do is just share a little bit about themselves, where you're from, what's got you interested in taking this class, something that's fun or interesting that you did over the summer, and maybe something that people might not initially know about you. So I know I'm putting you on the spot just a little bit, but we'd love to hear a little bit about yourself. Let's start over here.
So I'm from the islands.
Uh-huh.
And I took this class that I'm all welcome.
What is your name?
I'm Joshua.
Joshua.
I'm Joshua. And one thing I do for the summer. Come to Hawaii.
Yeah.
For vacation.
Yeah. Well, glad to have you here, Joshua. I think working on and building communication skills is something we're always doing in our lives. I think, communication is a lot of fun because it can really directly speak to things that we do every day. So glad to have you here. And how about over here?
My name's Eric. I'm from Tacoma, Washington.
Mhm.
I'm taking this class to just, learn some more about communication and like the whole process of everything that goes into it. I went to Mexico this summer and I play on the sports team for soccer here.
Awesome. Yeah, great to have you joining us. My family, I have family right near Tacoma, kind of in the Kent area there. So I go up there a lot. Awful traffic through Tacoma, but fun place to be. Glad to have you here as well. So again, I asked you both to complete that anonymous form and then just hand that in once we get done for today. All right. So for today, we'll be going over a model of communication and the 6 major parts of the communication process to understand that a little bit better. We'll also be talking about this idea of uncertainty reduction theory and some of the ways that we use communication skills in order to reduce the uncertainty that we experience around other people, we might consider to be stranger danger. And then we'll talk about perception, right? Perception is the way that we can cognitively see and understand and make sense of the world. A student in my morning class who said, I'm really tired, right? If you're feeling tired, if you've got the Friday-itis going on, you're eager to be done for the week, right? That's something that colors and shapes our perception. All right. So I want to first go over a model that helps us to understand and make sense of communication that we do with each other. And I think that a really good way to better understand it is through watching a sitcom show like The Office or Parks and Rec, because those shows and a lot of like workplace style comedies are essentially a whole lot of interpersonal communication. A lot of the punchlines, a lot of the humor in many of these shows and films, right, is from characters interacting with each other, characters having conversations with each other. Oftentimes, we like shows and movies that have good dialogue and good writing. So one of the things that we can do then is use a model of communication to help break down some of these parts. I can be a little loud, so I will over here. And these 6 different parts essentially allow us to map out how communication happens. So I'm going to share a short clip from The Office that shows all 6 of these parts at play. There's some humor that's a little bit risque. So if you're a little sensitive, just to let you know, but I like to alert people in advance. And as you're watching, right, pay attention to the ways in which Dwight and Jim are communicating with each other and some of the ways that they're making sense of meaning, almost like a game of ping pong where they're going back and forth.
Here's what's going to happen. I'm going to have to fix you, manage you to on a more personal scale, a more micro form of management. Jim, what is that called? Micro. Oh, yes. Now, Jim is going to be the client. White, you're going to have to sell to him without being aggressive, hostile, or difficult. Let's go. All right, fine. Look. I need paper. Excellent. Limited time offer only on everything. Oh, my lucky day. What is your name, sir? I am Bill Butler. Really, that's your real name? Dear. My family built this country, by the way. No, but hello? Yeah. I just thought about stupid, just slow down. Thought I was gonna keep them on the line forever and not buy anything. Okay. Sorry. Oh no, what's wrong? You know what? I'm sorry. We're having a limited, a little bit louder. Okay, as I was saying, right now, we're having louder. Okay, our prices have never been lower. Never talk loud. Never been lower. Louder, son, go louder. Our prices have never been lower.
So kind of fun, right? Very silly. A lot of shows like this one, right? What makes it funny is the way that the characters bounce off of each other. Clearly, Jim is, trying to give Dwight a hard time, being sarcastic and silly. Michael's trying to mediate the conflict and help their communication with each other. So I think one of the things that's interesting, right, is when we do a phone call, like what I mentioned, there's a lot of nonverbal communication that we don't get to pick up on. So we do not normally see like rolling eyes and, responding in the way that they did to each other and playing off of that. But they did have a pretty big role in how they related to each other and how we understood what was happening. Because Dwight was like rolling his eyes, and it was kind of egging Jim on to continue to give him a hard time, right? And pretend that he had some other call that he had to take and all of that good stuff. So I think this interaction helps us to understand the model of communication and many of its different parts, right? We start with a sender, right? The sender is the person that is delivering or giving the message. You can think about it as somebody that's uploading. So if you are uploading an assignment for a class or you're sending somebody a photo or video, right? You are the person that's essentially encoding and taking what's in your head and translating that over into language. In this case, Dwight, right, was asking about purchasing from Dunder Mifflin Paper Company. He was providing information and sending that out to Jim in that mock call, right? There's also what's known as a channel, which is the method by which something is communicated, right? So this was over the phone, though they were interacting face to face. It could be through text, email, etc. The message is being sent, but it's passing through some noise. So let's talk about these parts in a little bit more detail. So the sender encodes or develops that message, again, takes what's in their head, uses language or communication to translate that onto the screen. So oftentimes we find ourselves feeling like we don't speak the way we want to, we're tripping over our words, we're not articulate in the way that we want to be. That's an issue with encoding and sending a message. The receiver is the person that is downloading the message, right? They're receiving the message, they're taking it in, but nobody is taking in the message in a neutral way. Again, to go back to the last example, I bought a charger at the Apple Store. You decode that message because you know the Apple Store is for the Apple company. So the receiver understands and makes sense of the message based on their experience. And that might be limited based on their own expertise. If they don't know what the Apple Store is and they think it's produce, right? That's impacting their communication. Messages are the communication. So messages are sent textually, sending something such as an email. They're sent verbally, right? Communicating and speaking to the person, saying, oh, I've got to go talk to somebody on the other line. But messages, of course, are also nonverbal. So Dwight rolling his eyes, expressing frustration, Jim responding to that and kind of continuing to give Dwight a hard time. And the escalation to him yelling at the end is an example of how nonverbal messages have shaped their communication too. The channel is how the message is being sent, right? So it could be over the phone, it could be email, it could be face-to-face. Marshall McLuhan, who's a communication scholar, is famous for the quotation, "The medium is the message." Essentially arguing that the message itself is fundamentally shaped by how that message is being sent, right? We see this a lot if somebody is sending a TikTok versus writing an email, right? It's very different depending on the context and appropriateness of the situation. If somebody tells you that a close relative or family member has passed away, you're not going to reply with like a sad face emoji or "that's so bad," right? That would feel inappropriate. You'd normally do something like send it, like make a call or visit in person in order to talk about that in a bit more detail. So the channel shapes the communication and what that communication looks like, right? There's this kind of duality between how Dwight and Jim are talking as these characters on the phone based on compared to how they act in real life. Feedback is the response to the message. So one thing that your groups mentioned on Wednesday that I think is a great thing to point out is that interpersonal communication is shaped by the presence of feedback. What makes interpersonal communication unique is that the course of the conversation, where things go when you talk to somebody else, go in a billion different directions, right? A lot of us enjoy friends and relatives who are really good conversationalists, with whom we find ourselves learning all sorts of things or chatting about a whole array of different things. We don't go into every conversation knowing exactly what we're going to say and when. That'd be weird. And feedback is the way that we respond and modulate how we communicate. We're not going to talk at somebody to 10 minutes about our day if they look incredibly distressed, right? We're going to say, hey, what's wrong? What's going on? So our communication is adapting and responding to other people interpersonally. And lastly, we have this idea of noise, right? It's not one-to-one when we send communication between people. Noise is what is distorting or impacting the message. It's filtering and sometimes altering the message that we get. A really good example of this is if you ever send somebody a photo or video. I mentioned that I love live music. Sometimes I'll send a video of myself at a concert, and then I get frustrated because the video that I sent in no way captures the sound, the feel, what it's like there, right? It's kind of muffled. And noise is the same way in communication. Noise can be physical. You're talking to somebody down the hallway and there's like a really loud jackhammer or lawnmower that's hurting your ability to understand the message. But noise can also be psychological or mental. If you're dealing with a really challenging loss in your family, right? That's noise that's impacting how you're understanding a conversation with somebody else. If you're really tired, if you don't have some of those earlier stages of Maslow's hierarchy met, right? That noise is going to impact how you understand the message too. So I think this model is a really useful way of thinking about how communication happens. And I think another thing that's important to point out, right, is that we alternate roles. That is, sometimes we are the senders, but then we're responding to somebody else's message, right? So we're moving back and forth, kind of like a seesaw between these roles too. So I think this is a useful way to map out our communication a little bit more, especially as it happens interpersonally. Any questions? Great. The interaction we saw in the office, right, is also an example of perception. And perception is a really important way to understand how we communicate with each other too. One way of thinking about perception is kind of like laundry, right? Whenever you run a load of laundry, you're typically sorting your laundry based on color, based on what the shirt, what socks, or you could be like I was in college where you just had like this massive pile of clothes next to your bed. You didn't really know what was where, right? In any case, perception is how you sort out and make sense of your information. And perception has three parts. The first part is this idea of attending. Attending is figuring out what sensory information you're choosing to pay attention to and focus on. One example, if you ever see me upstairs in my office, I oftentimes have noise canceling headphones on. I really like those because they help me focus. They reduce some of the background distractions and things, right? I'm using selective perception where I'm only paying attention to what I'm playing, if I'm listening to music or what I'm working on, not paying attention to the side conversations that might be happening outside the room. So attending is choosing what you want to listen to. And we often find ourselves doing selective perception, selective listening. We tend to see it as a bad thing, right? Like suddenly we zone out or glaze over if a roommate starts talking about doing chores and you're like, oh, sorry, I missed it, right? But we also use selective perception as a survival tool. Think about it this way. If you listened to every single conversation and things happening at every given time, like 100% active listening, you would be exhausted within hours, right? On a typical day coming around campus. In order to preserve our own mental resources, we really choose which topics to focus on and pay attention to. We then organize that information, right? We use categories, we use models to try to make sense of and understand the world around us and understand the communication that we're receiving. So if somebody talks about the Apple Store, right, we're organizing that into being, oh yeah, the Apple Store where you could buy a charger. So making sense of that information, sorting that information, realizing that, hey, somebody is happy to see you or somebody's angry with you, right? You're putting it into those mental categories. And then interpreting is creating meaning to understand that, right? It's using our shared meaning of a thing in order to fully comprehend that message. So again, like we saw in The Office, right? He interpreted the interaction between those two as Jim just bothering Dwight because he was pretending to be on another call. He was telling him to speak louder, even though they could understand each other clearly, right? We picked up on those context clues to interpret and understand what was happening. So perception is important. Perception shapes how we choose to communicate with other people and what messages we choose to focus on. So what I would like to do now is give you the opportunity for a few minutes to do a bit of reflection and think about, what words you might use to describe yourself. You can pick anywhere between 3 to 5 words that immediately stand out in describing your interests, in describing how you would consider yourself to be as a person, and so on. So take a couple minutes to think about that. And then once you've done that, I want you to take some time to describe what makes somebody a good listener. So I'll be asking you to either type an email or hand in this at the end of class. So make sure that your name is on it. But take some time to think about this, how you would describe yourself in a few words, and also how you would describe what it means to be a good listener. Give you a couple more minutes. there anybody who'd like some more time? Okay. All right. So let's go around and I'd like you to share your response to number one. So the name or the word that you use to describe yourself. And as we're going around, if you could, please just remind us your names, since we're still kind of getting to know each other. And I'm trying to get those locked in. So let's start up here on the side. Yeah, the words you use to describe yourself.
I said athlete, kind, caring, loving.
And remind me your name.
Jason.
Jason. Okay.
I'm Nathaniel. I'm an introverted, curious, traveled, cunning, loyal, busy.
Nice. Second one. Go for it. Yes.
Oh,
No problem.
my name's Kaylee. I'm a college student at Career and Relationships.
Okay.
I'm Maddie, and I put brave and bold on. I'm Veronica. I put athlete, hungry, happy, smart, and kind.
Hungry. Heard some people saying they were tired this morning as well. So. Third one.
My name is Joshua. I put introverted. 100%. My name is Jared. I put athlete, thoughtful, believe.
My name's Bjorn. I put outgoing, perfectionist, and curious.
The back row through here.
My name's Lee. I put methodical, optimistic, personal.
Okay. Mhm. Mhm. Okay. Let's go to this side.
Eric, I put caring, friendly, funny, athletic, and real.
Nice.
I'm Gary. I put reserved and quoting my coworkers here from the summer, an old soul,
Nice.
dedicated, thorough, and straightforward. Giving me.
Nice.
My name's Anthony. I put comedic, intelligent, independent, honest, and considerate.
Let's move to the second row over here.
My name's Ella, and I put friendly, empathetic, honest, and dependable. And see, and then I put caring, athletic.
And in the back.
My name is Zach. I put positive, lighthearted, athlete, and competitive.
I'm Trevor. I put big-hearted, competitive, loyal, funny, and truthful.
And Brock, I put athlete, loyal, reserved, fun, kind.
I'm just basically put kind, athletic, and at times just pretty smart.
So thank you all for sharing. I really enjoy learning some things that you would use to describe yourself. And I also think that context is interesting, right? People who describe themselves as real, as street smart, animal lovers, situation matters in the types of labels and things that we use to define ourselves. So I asked you to do this to help us to think a little bit about this idea of both self-concept as well as self-esteem, right? The idea of us using words, of us using labels to define ourselves, relates back to this idea that communication shapes reality. A lot of authors, including Kenneth Burke, deal with this idea that we know who we are, We identify as something because we know what we're not. We say we're reserved, we are the opposite of, or we see somebody out there who's outgoing and say, I am not that, I don't like doing it, right? So building self-concept happens over time through our socialization, through communication with other people, right? And communication is the way that we know who we are. In a world without communication, we don't have labels or things that we can even use to begin to understand ourselves, right? This is part of why in case studies of individuals who, for instance, have been like locked in an attic or locked in a basement for several years, like as kids, and are asked to go out into the world, they have difficulty defining and understanding themselves without the ability to communicate, right? These are tragic case studies that also speak to the power of communication to help us to understand who we are and how we relate to the world, right? The words that you all use to describe yourselves, which might not cover the whole range or perhaps even the contradictory parts of yourselves, right? Connect to this idea of self-concept. The words that immediately came to mind, the things about yourself that you know to be true, refer to these stable ideas that we have about ourselves. If you feel that you're a kind person, right, that's oftentimes happened as a result of your social interaction. Oftentimes people might say, you're a very kind person, and that's stuck with you as a label that you use, right? Self-concept refers to the stories about ourselves that we tell about ourselves, right? And it's our sense of who we are as human beings. This is different than self-esteem, right? Self-esteem is about making this kind of value judgment about who you are. So if you were to say, I'm reserved, I'm pretty quiet, and I don't like it, I wish I was more outgoing and more talkative and more social, right? That's where you get into the role of self-esteem. So self-esteem, of course, is dependent upon culture and situation. Are you in a culture where talking loudly and sort of being more domineering is valued highly, or more collectivist culture where being a part of the group and being a bit more reserved is seen as important? So self-esteem refers to the judgments that we make about who we are and the value that we attach to these particular labels. So all of these are important as we're thinking about communication, defining who we are, and relating to other people in the communication process. The core element of this, right, how we come to understand and share who we are, the labels we use to define ourselves, but also how we choose to interact with other people and get to know about them, relates to this idea of uncertainty reduction theory, which is a pretty foundational theory in communication. This comes from Charles Berger and Richard Calabrese, who come from a communication studies background, and they're scholars interested in why it is that we communicate and the goals that we have in our communication. So uncertainty reduction theory, known as URT, essentially argues that we communicate with other people in order to reduce cognitive and behavioral uncertainty. How many of you are familiar with the term catfish or catfishing? So several of you. So not the fish, right, but the practice of pretending to be somebody that you're not online, right? Catfishing is a problem. There are a lot of people, including a lot of athletes and celebrities, right, who have been duped by somebody who maybe has a profile photo and pretends to be somebody totally different, who acts as if they're a completely different person. And then all of a sudden, right, we'll do something like say, hey, I really want to see you, but I need to pay for my flight. Can you like wire me $1,000, right? So there's a lot of scams that can emerge through catfishing, people being dishonest and fraudulent in the way that they present themselves. Catfish was also made into a TV show in which the hosts of the show help people who might have these dishonest people online actually meet face-to-face, right? And catfishing is a way that people experience concern over uncertainty reduction, right? So I'm going to show a short trailer from this show that kind of speaks to the ways in which uncertainty reduction is happening here.
Hi, Eve. I need help in meeting my fiance, Steven. Wait, I need help in meeting my fiance. Yeah. My name is Laura. I met the love of my life online 8 years ago and have yet to meet him face to face. 8 years ago.
He is literally like the perfect guy for me.
We haven't been able to find him or music by him anywhere. He isn't. So we did. I feel like we're definitely getting closer. Whoa. We got him.
What else have you done?
I give him my bank information.
What?
Yeah, if it was just transfer money. Yeah, how much? A couple thousand maybe. Jesus, man.
How do you pay it? I don't think about everything. You know, it's everything.
I'm in their driveway. What am I doing?
And what do you live in? Like, we in Timbuktu.
You don't think this girl has been using you? No, I don't think so.
Wow, Captain's curveball.
I'm not going to sleep well tonight. I have a lot to say. Yeah, I want to see myself with the truth.
So reality TV can be really weird in the way that it like portrays and dramatizes human experience, or like sets up people or manufactures people in a way to get ratings and interest. But anytime you watch a reality show, there's a good chance that you're seeing a lot of interpersonal communication at play and a lot of the ideas that we'll be talking about in this class, right? I think this show, this idea of like uncovering and figuring out if the person is honest and who they say they are online, is a really good example of uncertainty reduction theory, right? As you were watching, you noticed that working with the hosts of the show, right, the people try to figure out a way to meet these people that they've been talking to online face to face. Figure out if they're honest, who they say they are, figuring out if they actually get along, right? In that one case, right, finding out if they can actually meet their fiance for the first time, right? So some of these things are shocking and concerning because we would think that face-to-face interaction would probably happen before things like money would start to be transferred, right? So uncertainty reduction theory deals with this idea that communication is the process of reducing uncertainty, right? In other words, human beings, we're seeking patterns in behavior. We feel more comfortable the more predictable our interactions with other people are, right? This goes all the way back from a young age. We were probably told not to talk to strangers, or people we didn't know or trust, right? Stranger danger is taught for us knowing the concerns that come with cognitive and behavioral uncertainty. But the important idea here in URT is that communication is the way in which we break down those walls and we reduce uncertainty with other people, right? The more we talk to somebody, the more they choose to share, and we share with them, right? The more comfortable and safe we feel around them. So if you're texting and starting to really feel closely connected with somebody that's online, right, that's where the danger starts for a lot of these people on the show. They feel those walls coming down and they feel more certain about their relationships, even though there's some problems. Cognitive uncertainty deals with the information that we have available to us, right? So what do we know about people? How would we categorize them? If you're getting to know somebody, say you're dating somebody and you have deal breakers, things like kids, political and social issues, where you need to be on the same page, reducing cognitive uncertainty by learning about them. Behavioral uncertainty deals with the question of what people do. So for instance, if somebody, if we're trying to determine if somebody's safe, right, we might move back and forth on our levels of certainty and confidence with them. For instance, if somebody said, I didn't like when you yelled and screamed, that made me really uncomfortable, right? You'd experience kind of behavioral uncertainty in that moment. So we reduce uncertainty passively, right? A lot of monkeys and apes are really good at observational learning. They see one monkey that's able to open the box, and then using that observation, open the box up for themselves. So you might casually kind of passively observe somebody that you're getting to know. For instance, seeing another student in the class who's talking in a group and getting to know them a bit better. We can also actively reduce uncertainty. For example, active is not about talking to the other person, but it's about finding a way to learn about them, For instance, a lot of people, if they're starting to date somebody, might choose to browse social media and find the social media accounts of somebody that they haven't actually met face-to-face. Or if your middle school was anything like mine, there was the whole thing where people would go around and say, my friend asked if you like them. Do you like them or not? Right? This whole like secondhand asking a friend to find out if somebody likes you, right? Was an example of active. And then interactive is actually communicating with that other person, right? It's choosing to have a conversation with them and learning more about them. One thing that's really interesting about uncertainty reduction is that the more we communicate with somebody, the more we physically open up and gesture with that person. We like things that are predictable. Studies even say that we like people more the more that we interact with them, even if we disagree with them on a lot of things. We like what's familiar to us. Self-disclosure is the easiest way to reduce uncertainty, right? By choosing to share about ourselves, we tend to feel more comfortable. This also gets more and more open over time. So if you have this really sad story about your first day of school and getting caught up in a river, and you told that story to somebody you first met, they would probably feel like you were oversharing or it wasn't appropriate for the moment. But those more lopsided conversations and self-disclosure over time start to become more and more acceptable. So disclosing who we are to other people is the best way to reduce uncertainty. We consider the ability to reward and punish. For instance, if we're encountering an unsafe workspace and we want to come to our supervisor, we want to feel like the supervisor will support us in raising that issue, right? So oftentimes that's an important consideration. Is it safe to disclose and share? Is somebody meeting or going against our expectations? If somebody's going against our expectations, if somebody started yelling or screaming or showing a side to their personality that we like, then we tend to draw back and feel like we don't understand that person in the way that we thought that we did, right? We saw that in the show where somebody was not who said they were online through the process of reducing uncertainty by meeting. And then lastly, a question of whether or not we'll see them again. How many people have experienced road rage? Yeah, it's a lot of you, right? Oftentimes people will yell, scream, flip each other off because they know that they're not going to encounter them again, right? Oftentimes we're more motivated to learn about and share with people that we see ourselves working with longer term. So we tend to get this information quickly to try to reduce our uncertainty and make our interactions a bit more predictable. So I'd like to return to the second part of the prompt that I asked you to work on with listening. And I'd love to hear from a couple folks who want to share what it is that to them makes for good listening. Yes.
I said, like, I believe being a good listener and being able to be empathetic and like be willing to cast your own ideals and feelings aside to make them feel like heard and appreciated.
Yeah, empathy, putting yourself in somebody else's perspective is definitely important. What else?
Connection and the communication, like back and forth, and even if they're not agreeing with you, just the fact that they're like connecting with you, the conversation is going back and forth.
Yeah, that feeling of connection, right? Even if you don't agree, that you understand. So I think we're going to be hitting on more of those elements of good listening in the weeks to come. But to give a bit of a preview, right? The big factor of good listening, one of the most crucial skills in communication, is this idea, as Eric and Gary were getting at, of emotional intelligence, being able to understand the emotional state of other people. How many people read To Kill a Mockingbird in high school? Several of you, right? Atticus Finch had that famous saying in To Kill a Mockingbird, empathy is putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and walking around in them for a while. Being an empathetic communicator means understanding and adjusting and modulating your communication based on the needs of other people, right? So when we're disclosing, sharing, reducing uncertainty, we're doing so in a way that is trying to be sensitive to the needs of other people. And listening is one of the most important skills to communication more broadly. So to wrap up for today, we talked about communication to understand ourselves, right? Self-disclose. We talked about uncertainty reduction. And also talk to some of the things about good listening, in addition to mapping out this model of communication over time and getting into a lot of the nuts and bolts. For next class, we'll be doing kind of this writing workshop in class. It sounds like most of you have already completed that survey, but please hand it in if you worked on that today. I encourage you to read the Purdue OWL and Writing Center resources as we gear up for next Monday's class. Have a great weekend. Please email or pass forward your attendance activity for today. Make sure your name is on it. And I will see you again next Monday.